I wasn't sure what hurt more, the shock of the text or the fact that I was standing in the middle of a Parisian fashion show, the spotlight on me, while my world was unraveling. I had just wrapped up the final piece for the Runway, my latest collection, and I could feel the buzz in the air. It was one of those moments every designer dreams of, yet the excitement eluded me. The text from my wife came when I least expected it, an abrupt jolt in the midst of my professional triumph. "I'm leaving you. Don't look for me. I'm already gone." It was simple, straight to the point. I read it twice before I even realized my hand was shaking. I stood there, surrounded by high society, clapping hands, and photographers snapping photos of the new designs I had spent months creating. Yet, I could barely hear the applause. The bright lights blurred around me as I processed what had just happened. She was gone. She, the one person I thought would stand by me no matter where my work took me, had decided that life without me was better. But what did this mean? My mind went into overdrive, trying to put the pieces together. For years, I had been traveling, one fashion show after another, from New York to Paris to Milan. I hadn't been home much. I knew that. I knew she was frustrated with the distance, the endless hours spent on sketches, fittings, and interviews, but I never thought it would come to this. Leaving me without a word. Not even a discussion. Just a cold, final message. I was a designer at the peak of my career, and yet, there I stood, with the weight of betrayal pulling me down. I had everything. A successful career, recognition, fame, and wealth, but I felt empty. And more than anything, I was angry. Not because she left, but because she left without a reason, without any explanation. No phone call. No goodbye. As I stood there in front of a crowd of well-dressed, smiling faces, I realized my life was about to change. Not just because of my wife's departure, but because I could no longer ignore the subtle truths that had been bubbling beneath the surface for months. The people around me, my team, my colleagues, had all acted strangely in the weeks leading up to this. Was I being paranoid, or had they been hiding things from me? I wasn't going to let this go without finding out what happened. I had built my life around my work, but now, I had to rebuild my personal life, one piece at a time. The search for the truth began. Who was she with? Where had she gone? These questions gnawed at me, and I knew that I had to find out. But how? The plane ride back to my apartment was nothing like the usual rush. I was tired, but this time it was a different kind of exhaustion. I was a man on a mission. The last thing I wanted was to appear weak in front of the people who admired me. I couldn't let them see how broken I was on the inside. So, I did what any man would do. Push forward, pretending I was fine, burying the pain deep inside. The moment I stepped through the door of my apartment, I felt a strange emptiness. It was as if the walls had swallowed her presence completely. There was nothing left. No note, no belongings, just an air of abandonment. As I wandered through the rooms, I felt like I was walking through a dream. I stopped by her vanity, where I saw the remnants of her perfume on the counter. But she was gone. I opened her drawer, sifting through the clothes she had left behind. I found nothing unusual, just the usual piles of neatly folded fabric. But as I picked up a scarf, my heart skipped a beat. A small, unfamiliar key lay beneath it. I didn't recognize it, but it felt important. It was the first real clue I had. I wasn't sure why she had left it there, but I knew one thing. There was more to this than just a sudden decision to leave. She didn't just walk out. This was premeditated. She had planned it, and that realization hit me harder than anything else. She had a plan, and I was just left in the dark. I began to think of everything she had ever said about us, the moments she had hinted at being unhappy, the way she talked about wanting to travel alone, experience new things. Was this it? Had she met someone else? The questions piled up in my mind, and I couldn't stop them. I knew I had to find out where she had gone, but I didn't know where to start. I stood there, staring at the key. It felt like the first step in a dark journey that I wasn't sure I was ready for. But I had to take it. There was no going back now. I wasn't going to let her walk away without knowing the truth. And with that, the investigation into my wife's betrayal began. The following days were a blur of confusion and frustration. My mind couldn't focus on anything but the key. I knew it had to be significant. She wouldn't have left it behind unless it was. My usual world of fashion, creativity, and glitz seemed distant, almost irrelevant. Nothing felt real anymore. Not the applause, not the awards, not the flashing lights of the runway. All that mattered was finding out why she left. I couldn't afford to let anyone see how deeply this was affecting me. The fashion world demands focus, precision, and grace under pressure. So, I threw myself back into my work. I made calls, met with clients, and attended fittings like everything was fine. But my mind was always elsewhere, tracking down my wife. I tried calling her, texting her, but there was nothing, no replies, no voice on the other end, just silence. The coldness of it gnawed at me, but I refused to let it show. If she was going to play this game, I was going to play it better. I started by going through everything I could find at home. Her books, her journals, even the most mundane items were now full of potential clues. She had always been meticulous about keeping everything in order, and now I needed to understand why. In one of the drawers, tucked beneath a pile of receipts, I found an old address book. Her handwriting was still on the cover, as if nothing had changed. I thumbed through the pages, but nothing stood out until I reached the back. There it was. A name, an address, a phone number. I didn't recognize either the name or the address, but the phone number felt familiar. It wasn't just a number, it was a code, something encrypted that I didn't know yet. For a moment, I considered calling the number right there and then. But I stopped. I needed more. I couldn't let myself rush into this, not yet. My pulse quickened, but I kept my composure. I told myself that this was just another project to solve, another creative challenge. I couldn't let the emotions cloud my judgment. Instead, I decided to take the address and visit it in person. But before I did, I needed to understand more about her mental state before she left. I started thinking back to the conversations we had in the last few months. The subtle hints she dropped. There was the time she'd casually mentioned that maybe we needed a break, that maybe she wasn't sure about the relationship anymore. But she'd always dismissed it, brushing off her concerns with a joke or a half smile. I had let her do it. I had let her believe that everything would be fine, that I would always be there, busy with my career, but always ready to support her. Maybe I had been too absorbed in my world, too convinced of my importance in the fashion scene to realize what was slipping away right before my eyes. But it was too late for regrets. I couldn't turn back time. The following evening, I found myself standing outside the address she had written down. The street was quiet, almost eerily so. The buildings were old, but charming, with ivy creeping up their walls. I felt a strange sense of foreboding as I rang the doorbell. My stomach twisted as the seconds ticked by, but nothing happened. The door remained shut. I decided to leave, but not without a small bit of satisfaction. Whoever was behind this, I would find out. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. As I drove back to my apartment, I reflected on what had happened. It wasn't just about her leaving. It was about everything she had hidden from me. The lies, the secrets, the years I had spent thinking that we were working towards something together. But maybe she had already moved on. In the back of my mind, I knew I was starting to unravel a bigger mystery. The question was, how far did I want to go? The days that followed felt like I was drowning in a haze of unanswered questions and suspicion. I had made the decision to follow through. Whatever it took, I would uncover the truth. I couldn't afford to live in the shadows of my own life any longer. The idea of staying in a marriage built on lies was unbearable. She had left me without a second thought, leaving behind fragments of her existence that I was piecing together like a broken puzzle. But I was determined to put it all back together, no matter how uncomfortable the truth might be. I couldn't stop thinking about the address. I knew I had to return, but this time, I wasn't going alone. I enlisted the help of my assistant, Clara. She had been with me for years, and although she wasn't directly involved in my personal life, I trusted her judgment. She didn't ask too many questions. She just agreed to help, and that's what I needed. I wasn't ready to face whatever this was alone. The night before we were to go back to the building, I barely slept. My mind raced with possibilities. What had she been doing here? Why hadn't she mentioned anything about it? Was this where she had gone when she told me she needed space? Clara met me early the next morning. She was the only one who knew the truth about what was going on. Everyone else, my friends, my colleagues, the people who admired my work, had no idea. I needed to keep up appearances. I couldn't let anyone see me as vulnerable or desperate. But Clara knew, and that made me feel slightly less alone in this. I could trust her, and that was a rare thing in my world. We drove to the address, a small but elegant building nestled in a quiet neighborhood. As we approached, my heart started to pound in my chest. I couldn't explain it, but something told me I was on the verge of a major breakthrough or a devastating revelation. I turned to Clara, who was sitting in the passenger seat, her eyes scanning the area. "You ready for this?" I asked, though I already knew her answer. "Ready as I'll ever be," she said, her voice steady but laced with concern. I nodded, though inside, I was anything but steady. We got out of the car, and I led the way to the building's front door. This time, I wasn't going to ring the bell and wait for nothing. This time, I was going to force answers. We took the stairs up to the second floor, where the apartment was located. I knocked on the door. Nothing. No response. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. My patience was running thin. I had come this far, and I wasn't about to back down now. I pulled out my phone and called the number that had been listed next to the address. It rang for what felt like an eternity. Finally, a voice answered, "Hello?" I almost didn't recognize it, but it was unmistakably hers. It was my wife. My heart skipped a beat. "Where are you?" I asked, my voice flat, controlled. There was a long pause on the other end. "Liam," she said, almost as if surprised I had called. "I told you not to look for me." "You didn't tell me anything." "Not really," I replied, fighting to keep my voice calm. "Why did you leave me without any explanation? What's going on? Who's there with you?" "I can't. Liam, I can't explain right now. It's better if you just leave it. I need to move on." "Move on?" I repeated, the words stinging as I said them. "What about us? What about everything we built together? Some things just aren't meant to last. You need to let it go," she said, her tone cold, distant. There was no trace of the warmth I had once known in her voice. I didn't know how to respond. I had so many questions, but none of them felt appropriate. How could I keep asking her questions when she had already made up her mind to cut me out of her life? I ended the call before either of us could say more, but the damage had already been done. I was no closer to the truth, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever she was hiding, I would find out. There was no turning back now. I turned to Clara, who had been standing quietly beside me during the call. "She's not going to tell me anything directly," I said, my voice low but filled with resolve. "But that doesn't mean I can't find the answers elsewhere." Clara gave me a nod, understanding the weight of what I was saying. "You're not backing down, are you?" I shook my head. "No, this isn't over." And with that, I knew that I was deeper into this investigation than ever before. The truth was out there, and I was going to find it, no matter what it took. I couldn't let it go. The conversation with her on the phone had left me feeling more restless than ever. She had dropped that final bomb. I need to move on, but I couldn't understand how. How could she walk away from everything we'd built? All the years, all the shared moments, the trips, the sacrifices? It didn't add up. No matter how many times I replayed her words in my head, I couldn't find the logic behind her decision. I couldn't give up. She had left? Yes, but that didn't mean she could escape the truth. She didn't owe me an explanation, but I needed to know. The fact that she had so easily cut ties with me, it stung. I wasn't going to let myself become the man left in the dark, not without trying everything to find the answers. I had to find out who she was with, where she was hiding, and, most importantly, why. What had she been doing all this time that led to this point? The more I thought about it, the more I became obsessed with uncovering the hidden details of her life that I had missed. That afternoon, I went back to the address. This time, I was determined. I couldn't just sit and wait for things to unfold. I had to take control. I wasn't going to ring the bell again. No more subtlety. Instead, I stood outside the door, listening for any signs of movement. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, maybe just a glimpse of her, or even something that would give me a sense of where she was in this. I stayed there for what seemed like hours, watching the building, checking for anyone coming in or out. But it wasn't until dusk that something caught my eye. A man, tall and sharply dressed, walked into the building. He had a confident gait, and I couldn't help but notice the familiarity in his stride. He seemed out of place in this quiet, residential area. A few moments passed, and I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that this man was someone important. Maybe someone who had been involved in her life after all. Could he be the reason she had left? I took a mental note of his appearance and followed him from a distance. I had no plan, no exact idea of what I was trying to find, but I couldn't let the moment slip by without learning more. Eventually, he stopped outside a small cafe down the street and waited by the window. I stayed across the road, watching, until I saw a familiar face approach him. It was my wife. My stomach twisted at the sight of her. She hadn't changed much, still the same soft smile, the same confident posture. But it was the way she greeted him that caught me off guard. The way she leaned into him, almost as if they were already comfortable with each other. I watched them sit together. They didn't talk much. Instead, their hands often brushed against one another. The quiet intimacy was unmistakable. It was clear. She had moved on. I didn't know who this man was, but I wasn't going to let the mystery remain. This was the man who had taken her from me, who had somehow found a place in her heart while I had been consumed with my work. I had been blind to it, too absorbed in my own success, to notice the cracks in our relationship. It didn't take long before they stood up, and my wife kissed him lightly on the cheek. The kiss lingered just long enough for me to know that they were more than just friends. I felt sick. The betrayal cut deeper than anything I could have imagined. The person I had trusted most, the one I had worked so hard to make happy, was now with someone else, living a life I had no part in. The idea that she had been seeing someone while I was on the road, it twisted something inside me. I stood there for a moment, not knowing whether to confront them or turn away. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. I was too angry, too hurt. Instead, I retreated into the night, my mind spinning. I needed to know who this man was, and what he had done to pull her away from me so effortlessly. I spent the rest of the evening at my apartment, pacing back and forth, trying to connect the dots. Who was he? Why had she left me for him? Had this been going on for longer than I realized? There were so many questions, and I had no answers. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't done. I had seen enough to realize that this was only the beginning of something much bigger than I had expected. The person I thought I knew, the person I had spent my life with, was gone. And now, I had to unravel everything she had kept hidden from me. The next step was clear: find out who this man was. And I wasn't going to rest until I did. The following days felt like a blur, yet every second was filled with purpose. I had seen the man. I had seen the way they looked at each other. And I knew this was the piece I had been searching for, the final link in the chain that had bound me to my wife's betrayal. But I still didn't know who he was. And that, more than anything, was driving me mad. The silence between us was deafening. She had shut me out completely. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something critical. I had to get answers, and the only way to do that now was to dig deeper. The man at the cafe, whoever he was, had become my obsession. I couldn't just walk away from this. My pride, my anger, my confusion, everything demanded resolution. I went through every connection I had, hoping to find something, anything, that could help. It wasn't until I ran into a former colleague at a charity event that I finally got a break. He worked in the same circles as my wife had, even though we had parted ways professionally years ago. It was a casual conversation at first, but as I carefully steered the discussion toward her, I noticed his face twitch slightly. He didn't know that I had been watching her, that I had been unraveling the details of her new life. She's been seeing someone, hasn't she? I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral, but I knew I couldn't disguise the edge of bitterness creeping into my voice. His expression flickered for just a moment, then he quickly masked it with a smile. Well, Liam, you know how it goes. People move on. I pushed a little further, forcing him to give me something concrete. I know you've heard the rumors, I said, my voice dropping slightly. This man, the one she's been spending time with, who is he? There was another pause. I could feel the hesitation in his voice when he finally responded. His name's Ryan. Ryan Phelps. He's someone she met at a gallery event a few months ago. I didn't think it was serious at first, but, you know how these things go. Ryan Phelps. The name hit me like a slap in the face. I had never heard of him before, but there was something about the way my colleague had said it. Something almost resigned, like he knew the full extent of what had happened but was unwilling to give up any more information. It was clear that I was getting closer, but not enough. I needed more. I didn't waste any time. The next morning, I began to dig into Ryan Phelps. I wasn't going to let this man slip away from me the way my wife had. If I had to expose every little detail, every layer of his life, I would. His name was all I had, but it was enough to get started. I fired up my laptop and began a deep dive into his online presence. I wasn't expecting much, but it didn't take long before I found his social media accounts. It was the usual stuff: pictures of him at various events, shots of him with friends, and the occasional artsy post about contemporary exhibitions. But the deeper I went, the more I saw. The connections between him and my wife were undeniable. There they were, standing side by side at gallery openings, laughing together in photos that looked as natural as anything we had ever done. They seemed so comfortable, so perfectly at ease with each other. But it was the comments that caught my attention. They were subtle at first, but as I read more, I saw how the posts were starting to change. The captions became more intimate, more suggestive. "Can't wait to see you tonight," one comment read. Another, "Last night was perfect, more soon?" I felt a bitter knot tighten in my stomach. There was no denying it now. She had moved on with him. It wasn't a simple fling or a phase, it was real. And the more I saw, the more I realized just how much I had missed. She hadn't just found someone to pass the time with. She had found someone who shared her life in ways I hadn't been able to. I continued scrolling through his accounts, looking for anything that would give me insight into his character. But there was nothing that screamed red flags. He seemed charming, well-liked, and part of the art world, a world my wife had always admired. In many ways, he was exactly the type of person she had always gravitated toward. I spent hours researching him, piecing together his background, his connections. He was well known in the city's art circles, a curator for various exhibitions, and a rising figure in the contemporary art scene. In some ways, it made sense. My wife had always been drawn to that world, but I had been too consumed with my own career to notice that she was drifting further and further away. As I pieced together his life, the anger in me began to morph into something else. A quiet sense of betrayal settled over me. She had chosen him, a man who lived in her world, a man who could understand her in ways that I couldn't. And I had missed it. I had missed her. I sat there for what felt like hours, looking at the images of my wife, my beautiful, intelligent wife, with a man I didn't even know. My world felt like it had turned upside down, and I realized that the time for confrontation was rapidly approaching. I had already seen enough. I knew enough. The next step was to finally face her and ask the questions that had been haunting me for days. But even as I prepared to take that step, I felt a quiet voice in my head urging me forward. I couldn't let myself be consumed by this anger. I couldn't let this ruin me. I had to find peace, even if that meant facing the truth I had been avoiding. Tomorrow, I would confront her. And maybe, just maybe, I would finally get the answers I had been searching for. The truth was out, but it didn't feel like a victory. It didn't feel like anything other than the heavy weight of finality pressing down on me. She had made her choice, and I had no choice but to accept it. The anger, the bitterness, all of it started to dissolve into something else, something quieter, more reflective. I couldn't stay in that space any longer, in that same apartment where she had walked away from me without a second thought. So, I packed a small bag and left. I needed distance from everything that had happened, from the pain of seeing her with another man, from the weight of the betrayal. The first few days after the confrontation were a blur. I didn't reach out to anyone. I didn't call Clara, didn't check in with anyone from my team. I just needed time to think, time to breathe without anyone's expectations weighing on me. It wasn't just my marriage that had ended. It was a chapter of my life that had closed, and I needed to figure out what came next. I went for long walks in the city, trying to clear my head. The bustling streets of Paris that had once felt like home now seemed cold, indifferent to my suffering. I passed cafes where couples sat, laughing and sharing moments I had once taken for granted. It was strange, but I didn't feel as though I belonged there anymore. I wasn't sure what I was searching for, answers, clarity, or just a moment of peace, but I knew one thing. I couldn't stay lost in the past. I couldn't keep circling around the same thoughts of what went wrong. The only way to move forward was to let go. A few days later, I found myself back in my studio, surrounded by sketches and fabrics, the very things that had once consumed me. It felt different now, less like a sanctuary, more like a place of reflection. My work, my designs, everything felt like a distant memory. But then something clicked. The designs, the passion, they were still there. They had always been there. I grabbed a pencil and began to sketch. Slowly at first, but then with more urgency, as if the act itself was helping me make sense of everything. It wasn't just about creating something beautiful. It was about reclaiming my life. Reclaiming the parts of me that had been buried beneath the weight of my marriage, beneath the pressures of expectations. I didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, I knew I had to keep going. I had to keep creating, keep moving forward. The pieces were starting to fall into place, slowly but surely. Maybe it wasn't the life I had planned, but it was mine. And that was enough. As I finished my first new design since everything fell apart, I allowed myself a rare moment of satisfaction. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it was mine. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. Days turned into weeks, and the initial pain of everything faded. I still had moments of doubt, but I was slowly coming to terms with the reality of my situation. I had to let go of what was, to embrace what could be. I immersed myself in my work more than ever, but this time it felt different. The designs were no longer just a reflection of my career. They became a way for me to rebuild, to express the raw emotions I had kept hidden for so long. Every sketch, every fabric, became a step forward, a new chapter. I started to take on smaller projects, ones that allowed me to be creative again without the pressure of a big runway show. I found solace in the simplicity of design, in the process rather than the outcome. It was humbling, but it was also freeing. I spent more time with Clara, too, talking not just about work, but about life. It felt good to have someone who understood me, who had seen the chaos and now saw me moving forward, slowly but surely. And through it all, I realized something. I was no longer defined by the past. The betrayal, the hurt, it had shaped me, but it didn't control me. I had the power to move on. I had the power to decide what came next. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of it. I was ready to begin again. It was a crisp morning when I decided it was time to face the final part of my journey. I had avoided it for weeks, avoided the last conversation with my wife. But I knew it was the only way to truly close the door on that chapter of my life. I drove to her new place, a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. I hadn't been there since she left, but now, I needed to see it for myself. This wasn't about closure, it was about saying goodbye. Saying goodbye to the person she used to be in my life and accepting the person I was becoming. When I knocked on her door, it wasn't the usual silence that followed. There was a shift in the air, as though she knew this moment was inevitable, too. She opened the door, and for the first time since all of this started, I saw a familiar sadness in her eyes. It wasn't the same coldness I had seen when we last spoke. It was regret. We sat down in her living room, the space just as empty as the last time I had visited her. The walls, once filled with memories of us, were bare now. Everything was gone, except for the lingering silence between us. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice softer this time, "about everything. And I know I hurt you. I didn't mean to. I was just lost. But I see now that you found your way. I'm glad for you." I nodded, taking in her words, but I wasn't here for her apology. I had made peace with the past. "I found my way too," I said quietly, "and I'm ready to move forward." She didn't say anything more. There was nothing left to say. I realized, in that moment, that I didn't need her approval or understanding anymore. I had made it through the storm, and I had come out stronger on the other side. I stood up, walking toward the door. Before I left, I turned back to her one last time. "I hope you find what you're looking for," I said, my voice steady. "I hope you do too," she replied, her voice tinged with sadness. And that was it. The final chapter. The door closed softly behind me, and for the first time, I didn't feel weighed down by the past. I walked away, not as the man who had been betrayed, but as someone who was moving on, someone who had learned, grown, and finally found the strength to let go. The future, though uncertain, was no longer something I feared. It was something I was ready to embrace. I stepped into the world, no longer burdened by the ghosts of the past, but with the clarity of someone who had found a new purpose. My journey wasn't over. It had only just begun.